Elena's hands ached as she scrubbed the marble floor of the grand Steele estate, her knuckles raw and red from endless hours of labor, but she dared not slow down, for in this world of polished shoes and glittering chandeliers, a single mistake could cost her the little she had left. Once upon a time, she had been a young woman with dreams, sitting in lecture halls with a notebook full of poetry, her eyes bright with the hope of becoming a writer, but life had a cruel way of punishing dreamers. When her mother fell gravely ill, Elena abandoned her studies to care for her, working odd jobs just to afford the medicine that barely kept her alive, and when death finally stole her mother away, Elena was left with nothing, no family, no savings, no safety net, just a pile of unpaid debts and a heart full of grief. That was how she ended up here, mopping floors in the mansion of Adrian Steele, a billionaire whose name carried power across boardrooms and stock markets, a man she had never spoken to directly but whose presence haunted the halls like a god surveying his kingdom. On this particular evening, the estate pulsed with life as guests in glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos filled the ballroom for one of Adrian's famous charity galas, their laughter ringing out like crystal against the music of a live orchestra. Elena moved silently among them, balancing trays of champagne flutes, her plain uniform marking her as invisible, though the sting of their gazes reminded her she was seen, just not as a person, but as part of the furniture. When her tired hand slipped, and a drop of wine fell onto the silk sleeve of a wealthy guest, the woman spun on her with venom, her voice sharp enough to cut the music. "Watch it, girl. You're nothing but trash, do you hear me? Trash." The words pierced deeper than the sting of any wound, and though Elena's throat tightened, she forced herself not to cry, whispering instead, almost too softly for anyone to hear, "Don't throw me away, I'm not trash." She thought the words would vanish into the noise of the gala, just another unnoticed breath from an invisible servant, but standing just behind her was Adrian Steele himself, his glass of wine frozen mid-air, his sharp eyes fixed on her as though the whisper had awakened something long buried in his soul. Adrian Steele had built an empire out of numbers, contracts, and ruthless decisions, a life where people were measured by their usefulness and discarded when they no longer served a purpose. But that quiet whisper from the maid echoed in his head long after the gala lights dimmed and the guests departed, rattling him in a way that no business deal or corporate scandal ever had. He lay awake in his penthouse bedroom, staring at the ceiling, remembering nights from his own childhood when he had been passed from one foster home to another, treated as an inconvenience, a mouth too costly to feed, a boy who was often reminded that he was nothing more than trash in the eyes of the world. He had sworn never to feel that pain again, had promised himself that wealth and power would shield him from such humiliation, yet here was a young maid, fragile and exhausted, whispering the very words that mirrored his forgotten fears. The next morning, curiosity mingled with guilt pushed him to ask the house manager about her, and what he learned disturbed him deeply. Elena lived in a cramped storage room at the edge of the estate, working from dawn to midnight, rarely eating more than scraps left over after events, sending nearly all her meager wages toward paying off the debts her mother had left behind. She had no family to visit, no friends to confide in, no future beyond the endless grind of servitude, and yet she never complained, never raised her voice, never asked for anything more. Later that day, he caught sight of her again in the garden, her head bowed as she clipped flowers for the drawing room, her shoulders slightly hunched as though she were trying to shrink herself into invisibility, and for the first time in years, Adrian felt shame that a man of his wealth and power could live in such extravagance while someone under his very roof carried herself like a ghost, ashamed even to exist. He wondered when he had become so cold that he no longer saw the humanity in those around him, when he had stopped remembering that people were not assets to be used but souls carrying hidden battles. Watching Elena move with quiet diligence, he felt the stirrings of something long suppressed, a sense of responsibility, not just as her employer, but as a man who understood what it meant to be called worthless, and in that moment, he resolved that he could no longer remain silent. The days that followed felt strangely different for Elena, though she couldn't explain why. The air in the mansion seemed heavier, filled with eyes that lingered on her longer than before, especially Adrian Steele's, whose gaze she often caught watching her from across the hallways or during quiet moments in the garden, though he never said a word. She thought it was only a matter of time before she was scolded, perhaps even dismissed, for the embarrassing scene at the gala, yet when he finally approached her one evening while she was folding linens in the laundry room, his tone was not cold or commanding but curious, almost gentle. "Why do you let them treat you this way?" he asked, his voice low, and Elena froze, clutching the sheet in her hands as though it were a shield. She had no answer at first, only silence, until her lips parted and the truth spilled out, soft but heavy with years of pain, "Because I have nowhere else to go. If I lose this job, I'll have nothing. I can't. I can't be thrown away again." The vulnerability in her words struck Adrian harder than any boardroom battle, for in her brokenness he saw the reflection of his own boyhood, the same desperate need to belong somewhere, anywhere, even at the cost of enduring cruelty. For the first time in a long while, he abandoned his rigid detachment and spoke not as a billionaire but as a man who understood. "Listen to me," he said firmly, his eyes steady on hers, "you are not trash. Do you understand? You are not nothing." Tears welled in Elena's eyes, not because of weakness, but because no one had ever said those words to her before, no one had ever seen past the uniform and the dust on her hands to the human soul within. In that moment something shifted between them, unspoken but undeniable, and Adrian made a decision that surprised even himself. He arranged for her to move into proper quarters, had her wages increased, and quietly enrolled her in night classes, giving her the chance to finish what life had once forced her to abandon. The other staff gossiped, the world outside speculated when they began to notice her presence at his side during errands or events, but Adrian paid no mind to the whispers. What mattered was the light slowly returning to Elena's eyes, the way her shoulders straightened with each passing day, and the quiet truth that she was no longer invisible. Months passed, and Elena was no longer the fragile maid who drifted silently through the mansion's halls like a shadow. She walked with steadier steps now, her eyes brighter, her voice no longer trembling when she spoke, though she was still learning to believe in the worth Adrian had so firmly told her she possessed. One evening, he invited her to attend a charity gala, not as staff, but as a guest, and though she wanted to refuse, terrified of the stares and whispers, he insisted with a quiet conviction that left no room for doubt. Dressed in a simple but elegant gown he had arranged for her, Elena stepped into the glittering ballroom where once she had been invisible, and the same wealthy faces that had dismissed her now turned with curiosity, some with judgment, others with unease. When Adrian took the stage to address the crowd, he spoke not of profits or power, but of dignity, of how society too often crushed those who had the least, and then he invited Elena to share her story. With trembling hands clutching the microphone, she began softly, her voice almost lost in the grand hall, yet as she spoke of being discarded, of feeling like trash, of the night she whispered those words to herself in despair, the silence grew profound, and every face fixed upon her. "I believed I was nothing," she admitted, her eyes glistening, "but someone reminded me that our worth isn't measured by wealth or titles, but by the strength we carry through pain, and the courage to keep standing when the world calls us worthless." When she finished, the room erupted in applause, though for Elena it was not the sound of approval that mattered, but the sight of Adrian rising to his feet, clapping with pride shining in eyes that had once been so cold. Later, away from the crowd, he told her quietly, "You saved me too, Elena. I thought I had everything, but I had forgotten what it means to care, to see." Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from sorrow but from release, as though the chains that had bound her spirit for so long finally shattered. For the first time in her life, Elena no longer feared being thrown away, for she knew she was not trash, she was human, worthy, and deeply cherished.